Welcome to First Tuesdays. Thank you for joining us on this day after a holiday. And today we are very pleased to bring you a program with Nancy White from Full Circle Associates. And many of you may have met Nancy in the past through our peer learning experiments that we did with some Gates Foundation funding, and she was a regular and guided us in the online peer learning experience. So we're going to be happy to have her back. And before getting to do a full introduction of Nancy, I'd like to take a moment to once again welcome everyone and introduce to you Carolyn Peterson, who is here from the Washington State Library, and myself, Jennifer Fenton. And then to help you today with tech support is Jeremy Stroud. Non is on vacation, so Jeremy is our go-to guy. If you are having trouble hearing or seeing what is happening, then please do give a shout out to Jeremy, either in chat or you can call him at 360-570-5583. And once again, if you could just go ahead and type in the chat your name and the library you are from if you have not already done so, and that will help us to collect our statistics. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Nancy White, Full Circle Associates, and have her let us all in on what this whole twittering thing is all about. Welcome,
Thanks,
Nancy.
Jennifer. And you know me, I get excited. So if I start talking too fast or talking too long, I trust you will give me heads up to keep me honest, because I'm enthusiastic. I have been caffeinated, and I did get a lot of sleep over the weekend. So that's probably a disadvantage for the rest of you. So this is just a fair warning. Slow me down, stop me, interrupt me at any time. I'm going to lay out a couple of ideas, but my goal is in our conversation is to have conversation about these ideas. So jump in and we'll let it rip from there. And Jennifer contacted me a couple of months back saying, you know, would you do one of these First Tuesdays? And we talked a little bit about what we wanted to do, and we knew we wanted to do something about social media. And you know, that universe of social media is so ginormous. And it seems like every day there's another tool that comes across our screen. There's something else that someone says we should try, or you must try, or why don't you try. And it seems to me we need a way of assessing these tools as they fly across our radar stream and have some sense of their value in either our lives or in our work. And so today we're going to take the idea of thinking about how you look at a social media tool through the perspective of one social media tool, Twitter. Because a lot of people are talking about Twitter. It's in the media a lot. You know, you watch the evening news both locally and nationally, and it's hard-pressed not to hear a newscast that doesn't mention, and on Twitter today, so-and-so said. So it's become part of the vernacular of American public life. So why not understand Twitter, at least how it might be in American library life or in your life, whether you're an American or not. So I'm going to use Twitter as an example, but I want us to think about this process beyond Twitter. So I don't know, how many of you have been looked into the new Google+? Why don't you use the little raise hand tool that's just below the participant list. So we've got some hand raises. You've heard about it. Okay. Now, if you've used it and liked it, put a smiley face. And if you've used it and you can't figure it out or you don't like it, put that little frowny face. Okay, so already we've got some diversity here. And I think this is really a key thing as we go through this assessment process, is that we will all engage in social media in different ways. It will mean different things to us, and it will mean different things to our libraries, okay? Just like we use the telephone differently, or we use snail mail differently. So I want to keep that individual and organizational perspective as we go through this conversation. It is diverse. It is not this sort of simple on-off sort of thing. So, and there's those of you joining us, welcome, and jump in at any time. So just like we have diverse experiences with social media, we might have different ways of doing our assessment. So today I want to offer you two. And these may or may not work for you, but the point of showing two different ways in is to say, yeah, you know, there are different ways that we can do this. And how rigorous you have to be plays into it. How much this is dictated by your job or by your personal interest will drive it, and how much time you have for this will drive it. But the goal is that we each have some little rubric that we can use when someone says, hey, why don't you try out this tool, so that we can at least dip in and say, okay, how do we do it? So the two I'm going to offer you today, one is a checklist, and we'll share a document with this checklist plus links to all the resources that I'll be sharing, which are quite a few, at the end and on the what do you call it, the web page where Jeremy puts the archive. I may be awake, but my brain doesn't always find the words I'm looking for. So I just put together a little rubric that is based on how I look at social media tools, because often I'm asked to do it on behalf of others. I ran this rubric by a bunch of my friends, and I'll tell you that story a little bit later, to see what they had, and they added a lot and changed a lot, and actually we took off like 7 rows, which I was very proud of because it was too long. So the idea that a rubric is something simple enough that you can do and remember. The second approach is simply using a set of questions. It's a more conversational point and more informal approach. And this example comes from Beth Kanter, bethkanter.org, who is a fabulous resource on social media in nonprofits. She's a fellow at the Packard Foundation. She's their social media fellow and has been now for 2 years. And she's also very interested in measuring and evaluating the benefits of social media for those who are getting in deeper. So she's a fabulous resource. And her input via Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus has been a key part of this presentation. So I almost feel like Beth is sort of sitting on my shoulder right here, talking with us while we're here, and I hope I'm channeling her well. So, you know, she looks at objectives and workflow and features and things like that. Now, what these both have in common, no matter how you look at it, is why are you looking at a tool? You know, what do you want to accomplish? And it was very interesting when we had the conversation with my peers about this, what do I want to accomplish? Someone says you need to make sure people think about at what level, okay? Are they talking about as me, the individual, or me with you? So maybe, you know, Jennifer and Jeremy and I are plotting something to do together online, and what social media tools do we want to do it? Do we want to do it at the organizational level? In other words, is this part of our strategy, be it an experimental, tentative strategy, or something is a way that it's a regular way that we reach out to our patrons or our supporters or the policymakers who are influencing our funding? Or do we actually want to reach out at a larger level? So when we think about issues like literacy, when people are really working to help parents figure out how to bring a culture of literacy to their children, that's at the societal level, and the social media tools we use as individuals or interpersonally or organizationally can go out to that level. So, and in fact, social media is particularly good at these wide things. So I want us to think about, when we look at a social media tool, at what level do I want to accomplish and what it is I want to accomplish. And then we can ask those things like, who do you want to engage with, and think about how the tool might help that. The last part of it is also super important, is how this aligns with my other goals and activities. One of the things that everybody tells me, this is like, I don't talk in definites very often. This one's definite, is people don't have enough time. There's too many options and opportunities. So we have to think about how the practice of using a new tool fits in with our existing goals and activities, and perhaps what it can replace, which means what can I stop doing instead of having to keep doing more things. And I think this is a question all of us need to be asking about our work in general, but social media kind of pushes all the buttons around that, around time. So I don't know, curiosity here, how many people here have time in their job to experiment with social media tools? Put a smiley face. And those of you who don't have time, put, you know, that little gray wiggly smile. I never know what to call the wiggly face guy. So some of you have time, but perhaps less of you. So this is a tension that we have to live with. The fact is we can't ignore it's happening, so we have to figure out what we can stop doing or how this can work with our current workflow. So any questions yet? Is this making sense? If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll stop for some questions. Doing okay. Okie dokie. Now remember, at any time, raise a hand, put something in the chat room. We'll do this, okay? So I want to start with the more formal rubric, just because it gives us a little structure to talk about. And I want to work through each of these things. Now, for the first couple of them, I'm going to put some comments up, and I'll repeat this slide. But after a while, I'm going to stop doing that because it gets redundant and repetitive visually in terms of engagement strategy and illuminate. But this is something that you could actually print out, put it on your desk, and say, okay, I'm going to devote 5 minutes a day to investigating Twitter. So here are the steps I might want to take. So we talked about purpose. And so let's just do a little thing. How many of you here have, or how many of you, I can speak English. Put a green check mark if you currently use Twitter. Put an X mark if you don't use Twitter. And I'm trying to think of what mark to put for those of you who are in between someplace. That might be Claire or Jeremy or Kate. Okay. So most of you don't. So Anna and Claire, do either one of you have a microphone today? Type in the chat room if you have a mic. Okay. So Anna, I'll ask you to type it in if you would. What is the value that Twitter is giving you? And Claire, you want to grab the mic and say something about the value it provides to you?
I haven't used it often, but I've used it during webinars.
Claire, we can't hear you. Please take up your mic.
The volume's down.
Wow. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can barely hear you, unfortunately. Maybe you could type it in the chat room. So because you said you don't use it often. And Anne, if you could type in, what value you've seen, because we'll build on your experiences as well. And while you guys are typing on that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that some of my other, okay, Anna says, our students don't necessarily read the student listserv for information. Twitter, okay, so Twitter. Now, Anna, one of the things that I notice about Twitter is that because it has an interface that is mobile, so you can see the tweets on your computer screen or you can get them delivered to your telephone, that for highly mobile people like students who are walking around a lot, a mobile interface becomes really important. I notice with my adult children, they interact with Facebook on their phones, not on a computer screen. So Twitter is one of those things that can cross platforms, which makes it a unique tool, and that we'll get more to that. And so Claire, you've used it during webinars. So you to tap into people outside of the webinar might be a way. Sometimes when I'm doing very much a how-to Twitter thing, I'll definitely tap into my Twitter community and ask them to comment on their use of Twitter into the webinar. So one of these things here is that you use Twitter to send messages out. It's to communicate, to push messages out. Another purpose is to engage in these kind of short conversations with people about things. You have a question. Can I get some help with this? Who knows what? Who has tried this? What's the best new book for young adults related to environment? I don't know. There's lots of things that you can do for these short bits of back and forth. Twitter is basically a short message service that gives you 140 characters. So thinking about information in and out and in a short form is one thing. Another purpose that Twitter can be is for building one's network. So let's say you're working in a remote library and you'd like to actually connect more with other librarians in similar circumstances. You can develop a list of colleagues on Twitter and use that for keeping in touch in a very light way. It's not quite as intense as a listserv or as a web page discussion board. It's light. So when I'm thinking about why I use it, I also have to ask a couple of other questions. Am I going to use this as an individual, in which case I'm using my name and I'm responsible, or am I using it on behalf of my organization? And if it is an organizational account, then there's some additional steps we need to think about. And this would be true for any social media tool is, what is the social media policy with my organization? How does my boss feel about this? Do I need to get permission? In some ways, starting with a personal experiment can give you more insight into a tool that then you can approach your organization. So a strategy may not always be going directly to an organizational approach. Start perhaps with a personal experiment. And then we can ask the question, you know, who do I want to connect with? So for this little case study, I'm going to say, I want to see if I can better connect with librarians like me. My target audience is other people like me, or people who would, you know, have something interest. So when we think about people directly like me are of use, but there might also be some people who aren't exactly like me, but who would be useful in this conversation about being a rural librarian. So we're thinking about that. Now the value I expect to create here, I guess I could use a little pointer when I'm doing this. I'm waving my hands here, and you can't see me waving my hands at my desk. The value creation is thinking about how would I measure if I know I've been successful? Because if I'm going to invest my time, I've got to have some way of knowing that the time is well spent. And I think this is a really important part of a social media experience is think up front is, how do you know that when you've done something successful? So my measure here is I want to see if I can meet 2 or 3 other people who I didn't know before and get some ideas from them. Because it's a small experiment. I don't want to, you know, wish for them in. So that would be the first part of it. And I jot down my notes. And, you know, when I use a rubric, I usually put questions down here, things that I thought I understood, but I didn't once I started, and having people do that. Now, how did I get there so fast? What did I do? I think with my pointer, I went too far. Okay. So then the next thing with social media is, okay, how do I get the tool? How do I use it? How do I download it? Is it okay in my IT organization? So some places there's lots of prohibitions against using social media, and that means the experimentation may be done personally at home if you're willing to do that. Sometimes we have to ask permission to have a port open, which means a certain internet address might have been blocked because of blocking tools that your library uses, and you may need to get permission either on your computer or however your IT is set up. So sometimes we have to ask questions of IT. Now, this is a two-edged sword. When we ask questions of IT, sometimes there is a tendency to be more conservative and lock things down. So if you have a good relationship with your IT people and talk about how you're learning and how you're doing an experiment and how you intend to measurement, this can often be a more, generative way of approaching them instead of just saying, open up this or can I use this, and you get the no answer. There's a point of negotiation. I think what I find is when people build some trust about why people are asking for this, it becomes easier over time. So if you take a little time the first time you experiment and build that relationship with your IT people, it can be a lot better. I don't know. Jeremy, you may have some thoughts on that. Do you have some thoughts on that if you're still hanging around?
I'm still hanging around. Not a whole lot right now. We haven't really explored it too much.
Okay. Well, you probably will run into it. It's a very challenging thing, particularly people who are working in institutions who work with children. They have rules in place for good reasons, but they can be very, they can shortcut other productive uses of social media. So I think it's useful to have that kind of conversation. Bonnie's giving me you must know about this, Bonnie. Do you have something to say about this? Okay, feel free to grab the mic if you want to, Bonnie. I see your typing.
I just want to add to that we are really just beginning to branch out and look at Twitter and LinkedIn and all those with professional level accounts just to see how all this does work out and shake out. But unfortunately, I'm not the one at the forefront of that here. I should get Kirsten and Frol in touch with you later on so you can talk to her and maybe bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah, and you know, it's very interesting. There are some state agencies in Washington State who are doing some very interesting and very effective social media. I would say Washington State DOT is known nationally and internationally for their work using Twitter. And there's other Washington State organizations, government branches that are doing it. So we do have some good examples in Washington State. But yeah, the lockdowns in technology for me are something, we call this technology stewarding, is really working at helping get to the issues rather than using some sort of binary rule for yes, no about how to use things. So, you know, it's a conversation. So if you're very interested in experimentation across social media tools, build that relationship. Bring some chocolate chip cookies in, you know, do what you need to do to get the relationship going. The other thing I like to think about before I install a tool is to find out if it replicates, replaces, or fills a tool gap. So this is again thinking, what does a tool do for me and how does it fit into my tool ecosystem, you might say. And I like to ask this question early on, even if I don't know the answer, because by making this question conscious, I find I do a better job of evaluation. So I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly, and I'm happy to dig deeper into any of them because there's a lot of conversation. So with Twitter, I'm thinking, okay, will Twitter replace email in some cases or listservs, as Anna said? So I'm thinking about, I don't want more, I want something that does what I need done perhaps better than what I'm doing right now. With Twitter, then you also find out that you can use Twitter via your browser. You can use Twitter via what's called a client, which is a separate piece of software that you download and, you know, tell it your Twitter identification information. I use a Twitter client called TweetDeck, and I'll write that in the chat room because I find it easier to use than the web page, because I tend to open up too many tabs in my browser and then my browser crashes because I guess I have poor browser hygiene. So, you know, I'm thinking about these things, and so I go to the twitter.com, I make an account. For me, I use either my Nancy White name, or if someone already has that, because there are lots of Nancy Whites, I use my alternative web identity, which is Choco Nancy, the woman who loves chocolate. And so I have a good identity that I use consistently across different social media tools. And if you're using social media organizationally or individually, you want to think about how you do that across tools if it's a larger strategy. So what you use for your account name for these things can matter, okay? Then you'll also want to make sure it's compatible on the types of devices that you want to use. So most social media tools now are compatible on Mac and PC. More and more have a mobile interface, and for those of you dealing with younger generations, this is your reality. The mobile interface, the mobile phone interface, or the cell phone, whatever you want to call it, is part of the reality. So if the people you're trying to reach are those people, you need to look at that, even if you may not be a mobile user. For me, this has been a challenge. I'm not a mobile user. It really pushes me, particularly with my eyes and the small phone and little teeny keys, you know, it's difficult for me. So this is something that I look for, something that has both a PC and a phone interface. So in the day-to-day, I can work on a platform that I'm comfortable on, but the people I want to interact with are also using the platform they're comfortable on. So you kind of go where people are. Another question that I think comes up for a lot of social media is like, how is X different than Y? So how is Twitter different from a Facebook status? So this would be one of the questions I take into my experiment here. Okay, so then we start getting into the how-to stuff. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you how to do Twitter. There's lots of great tutorials out there, lots of people. And so I think it's really useful to think about those things. So, you know, some of the things that I just said, because I actually should have put this slide up sooner, was, you know, you make the account at twitter.com, you decide if it's personal or organizational. On the Twitter page, you can set up a home page, and there's actually ways to do this well. The little 140-character bio in Twitter turns out to be a really important thing if people are going to decide if they're going to follow you and read your tweets or not. You're going to put your organizational logo on that page. Lots of little questions there, and there's lots of guidance. And then, of course, the tools that I talked about. But let me go to the next one and say, okay, there are lots of great resources. Don't have to figure this out by yourself. At the end of this slide deck, I have about 20 resources, and that's also on the web page that Jeremy posted earlier. Use one of these things. They're great. So this one, for example, is a great kind of digital, puts together one page that can be no longer than one page for social media tools, which is why I like them, because they're short. Okay, I don't have a lot of time, but more than time, I don't have a lot of attention span. So this one tells me how to get started, the basic ways of things, and you know, some of the basics of Twitter are is that when you do an @ and the username, that makes sure that person sees the reply if you want to get their attention, if you want to, they say, point messages at specific people. And it's also a way of acknowledging people. So one of the things that people love is when they've done something useful and they're thanked for it or acknowledged. So let's say my friend Elsua, he's E-L-S-U-A on Twitter, is a knowledge management guy who does a lot of stuff. So if I get a great tip from him, and his real name is Luis Suarez, I'll go @Elsua, thanks for that pointer to, and whatever it is he pointed to. Or I can share what he did by doing what's called a retweet. So it means I send out someone else's tweet again to my network. And we'll talk about networks in a minute. I just got ahead of myself. So these little things, these little practices are at the heart of a useful practice, but they're not obvious by looking at the Twitter page. So I go to any of these social media tools, and the utility is rarely that obvious. So learning from other people is, for me, the primary learning strategy for learning new tools. So for example, Beth Kanter has a fabulous slide deck called 10 Habits of Highly Effective Tweeple. Little played on tweets and people. Fabulous. You can look at this, and in looking through her slides, this is a slide deck that actually can stand alone without narration, learn all about tweeting and retweeting and how to build a network. So all the things that we don't have time to talk about on a short First Tuesday, you could go look at this at your own time. If you're a person who is far more playful, you could go to an 8-minute video where this crazy person, Nancy White, teaches a puppet how to tweet. And this was actually a really fun thing. And looking at the time, I'm not sure I should show it. Jeremy and Carolyn and Jennifer, do you think I should try showing the URL just for fun? Any thoughts?
Well,
Carolyn will think it's a tease, but
yes, yeah. Carolyn thinks it's fun. Go for it.
Okay, so we're going to see if this works. Okay, I'm doing a web tour, and it should pop up a window that would get the video loaded, and we'll just get it loaded. But some of you who might be on lower connections might not be seeing it. So when you start seeing it, put a green check, and that way I'll get a sense of. Okay, so I'll stop that there, but Susie and I were making the point that I do still think is most important is watching someone else, looking at it and seeing how they do it is just magical, and it's so much more fun, and it's so much easier. But some of us like to learn by plowing through things, and if that's your style, so be it. So then we get into the next phase, which is, figuring out that practice. And I want to talk about two different sort of meta practices that show up in almost all social media that particularly apply to Twitter, and use this again as an example of how do I figure out a tool. And there are, the first part is connecting and listening to other people, okay? If you're simply broadcasting, yeah, that's one way you can use social media, but it tends not to be a very sustainable thing, because if you don't show that you're listening to other people, they stop listening to you. Listening is a reciprocal act. It is not simply a broadcast act. There's time for broadcasting. You can broadcast on Facebook and Google Plus and blogs and wikis and Twitter. But if you don't have connections with people and you're not listening to them, that will end very quickly. So one of the things on Twitter that you need to do is create an initial network, is to figure out who to follow. And by follow, that means those are the tweets that will show up either on the Twitter page for you or on your phone or on your Twitter client. And you can't listen to all the tweets in the world, because I don't know how many billions and trillions of tweets per day there are right now, and there's a lot of garbage in there. So for me, if I'm trying to build relationships with other librarians, I want to start finding a few librarians, see who they follow, and then start following those people. And that way I start getting a sense of, who's talking here. Now, there are lists that people curate. So there's called Twitter lists. You can look for Twitter lists. And there's all sorts of tools to find other people. So one of the things you might want to do early on is explore how to find the other people you want to connect with in the social media world. Now, there's a lot of people who've written lovely little tools, little tutorials, and this is one that came across my desk the other day from Media Bistro. And what was very interesting is built on a survey about why people are willing to follow you. Because when you first follow, you hope that they'll want to follow you back. And thinking about what you say informs whether they'll follow you back. So this little chart asks some really interesting questions about why people follow people or why people stop following people. And I think this goes again to saying enough but not saying too much. So looking at these little tools can be a useful way of understanding what you want to do. Then how you want to talk. Okay, what's the conversation? So if I think about my goal is to connect with other rural librarians. And one of the ways is to then offer something of value that I know to them. Now, this is called reciprocity, but it isn't usually one-to-one reciprocity. It may be I tweet something out and then someone else responds to me, or they may retweet it out to their network. So I have 10 people on my Twitter follow list, and one of those people has a huge follower list of 500 people, and they retweet it out, and all of a sudden, that starts creating new conversations with people that I didn't have access to before. So by putting out valuable content, you can attract followers and find followers. You can also think about how often you do it. And if you do it too often, frankly, people don't like it. It's just too much noise. You think about how you weave with what other people are saying instead of just kind of like talking by yourself. So let's say someone posted something about what to do when rural library hours are cut. You may chime in and say, here's what we've done in our county. I'd be interested to know what other people are doing, particularly when it's back to school time or whatever that might be. So you're showing a conversational mode here versus simply putting out a message. You can also retweet things that are valuable to other people. You can suggest other people that you think people might want to follow. Let's say if you're following someone really great about rural libraries, you might say, follow at rural librarian Nancy. She is posting great stuff. And that shows that you care about rural librarian Nancy. And Nancy's going to start paying attention to you. So this is like a conversation. Think of a cocktail party. First you go around listening, you're sipping your drink, you maybe having some hors d'oeuvres, and then you engage with one or two people. But by the end of the party, the conversations are really going and things are really cooking. But it takes that getting going. Also, when someone says something about, at Nancy White, I like to respond to that to let them know that I heard them. So this responding. And that requires a certain amount of monitoring. So what I do is I use TweetDeck. And I can set up persistent searches for when people mention my username so that I can respond. Or I can set up a persistent search for certain words that people mention. And these are called hashtags. So like a keyword, they're preceded by a pound sign. And then you can follow a hashtag instead of following a person. So if there's something interesting going on around chocolate, I can follow the hashtag chocolate. Okay, just want to stop here for a second. Am I making any sense? Put a green check if it's making sense. Put a red check if a red X if you're confused, and then we'll figure out what the point of confusion is, and you're very smart people. Okay. When there's silence, I always have to imagine, what are they doing? Is this making any sense to them? Okay. So here's the other half of that same graphic I showed you before is, it talks about what makes people retweet, and 92% it's interesting content. So people care about quality content, and they care about who it's coming from. They also interestingly enjoy humor. So keep your sense of humor handy when you're using Twitter, for example. It's not the most serious social media. I'd say LinkedIn is a far more, quote-unquote, serious social media platform. Okay? But I love this takeaway. Tweets don't care if you give them things or ask them to help. They'll retweet you if they like your stuff or they think you're funny, which is an interesting thing. Now, this was a small survey. Take it with a grain of salt. But I found that very interesting. And sometimes I'm pretty serious. So it was interesting to rethink that a bit. There's a couple more application realities that I think are worth bringing up. And again, these came from my friends. I said, don't forget about this. who do you want to interact with, and how much are they willing, or are they willing to use the tool you're considering? And I've seen a lot of organizations say, well, we're going to launch this huge social media strategy, and they forget that the people that they're working with don't use those particular social media tools. So there are studies. The Pew Internet research does some great stuff about demographics of who's using which tool. There are also some generalizations we have to be careful about. My mother her primary communication tools used to be just the phone. Then it was the phone and email. Then it became email and she didn't pick up the phone. And now it's Facebook. My 82-year-old mom on Facebook, following all her children. Pretty soon she'll start following her great-grandchild. So thinking about how those trends are shifting, check the data. Those trends constantly shift. But for example, Twitter is hugely used. Google+, we'll see where it'll go. The early adopters are the geeky tech community so far. So it hasn't really expanded broadly outside of that, and it has some challenges that it still has to figure out. Of course, everything from Google is in beta forever. The other thing that I think is important to consider is that everything you put online becomes an expression of you. And some people find this fabulous, some people find this horrific, and most of us sit someplace in between. But it's important to think about it. So my bottom line is I don't tweet or post anything that I would be ashamed for my mother to see, because these days, in fact, she'll see it. And I don't put any information that I don't think is viable enough to be on my newspaper. Or if I do, I say, I have no idea, but this is what I heard. So that it is as accurate as I can portray it. The third is don't slander. You know, if you don't, there are a lot of people who make their entire living or their reputation out of saying snarky, mean things. Personally, I wouldn't do that. Again, these decisions about how I want my identity to be seen online are personal. When we're doing this on behalf of an organization, it is more than personal. So this is where social media policies are really useful. If I put a link in the final slide about examples for social media policy, happy to talk about those. I'm just about through with my spiel and we can go fully into conversation. Does anybody want to ask anything about that right now before I move on? My audio went. Did my mic just slipped? Is that better, Anna? When I wave my hands, this mic sometimes flies away. Okay. Thank you for flagging that. I appreciate it. Okay. So then the next phase is doing an experiment. And there's this guy named Dave Snowden who works in the field of complexity. And he has this thing he calls safe-fail experiments, which I love because you want to do something that if it doesn't work, you can still learn from it. Because some of this stuff is not always going to work. So I like to think of small things. Beth talks about 15-minute experiments. So what can you do quickly with a social media tool like Twitter to see what it's like? So here's one that came out of that same slide deck from Beth about highly effective tweeple, is to think about doing 5 tweets a day for 5 days and see what happens. And here is some things that you could think about. So for me, this is an experiment. This is just about an individual trying to see what Twitter feels like. If I was trying to go back to that goal of connecting with librarians, I would probably think about 5 tweets, which are my 5 best tips about being a rural librarian, 5 retweets, RT is retweet, of other great librarians in the links. I'm not so big myself on inspirational quotes. Something funny, 1 thought, 2 words. Me, I kind of save those till I have my network built up. I'd probably put those later. But 5, answer questions and ask questions. I would do this really, really strongly. And I would find 1 or 2 people that I would ask directly. So I'd say, at Nancy White, what do you think about the dark chocolate at Fran's? And so I would definitely do that because it's amazing. People who know things love to share it. It's a fabulous thing. So, that's one experiment. Another one is, here's another one out of the social media lab. This came out of an arts organization. But again, it just thinks about, what you're going to tweet about. And it gives some structure to it. And for those of us who are busy, having a little structured experiment can be useful. But, going back to that idea of asking 1 question, here's what I did on August 17th around 10:30 in the morning to prepare for this. I experimented by putting this question out on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Google+. And to see what I got. and it was amazing. In the next hour and a half, things started coming in, but it was very interesting. First, it came in from Facebook. Then it started coming in from Google+. And the Google+ conversation got so interesting that other people saw it and started joining in. And that conversation really took off. The Twitter one didn't take off at all. Now, I have, how many followers? Like 2,000 followers on Twitter, which is a lot of followers. I'm fairly high ranking because I started early. But there's so many people following so many people, it's hard to get attention. And Google+ is still relatively new and people are paying attention. So this is one of the really interesting tensions. Twitter didn't turn out to be as good of a question and answering tool for me for this question than Google+ did. But in the past, Twitter has been a super great source for answering questions. So has my network gotten too big, or am I following too many people? All of a sudden, that sort of direct conversational stuff can be a little more difficult. But I'm just going to flip through. You'll see that, people kept on answering. And in fact, that conversation is still going on today.
May I, Nancy, just a moment. It looks like, Gina, do you have a question? You have a check mark there. I just was curious. Do you have a question or a comment? Looks like she's typing away.
Okay. Yeah, it's good. Thank you for helping me pay attention, Carolyn.
Okay.
Confirming that the sound was loud. Great. Good. Okay. So, so then we get on how do I know I'm succeeding? So there are a bunch of tools that help us actually understand the reach of a message. So if I'm trying to publicize a library event, I want to see if I am reaching the people I want to reach. And some of these tools here can give you some sense of looking at that. And I'm not going to go deeply into this, but the last one, Beth Kanter again, has some lovely stuff here. I think once you get past the first light experiment, it's really useful to look at evaluation because it can give you some metrics to understand how much time you should or shouldn't devote to Twitter or any other social media tool. And again, I think you can get obsessive about measurement, but if you don't pay attention to it at all, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. So it's finding the place that's right for you around measurement. Okay, so getting to the end of the talkie here. I'd like you to think about what you've heard today and think about, are you willing to do a Twitter experiment? Okay, I'm going to give you a moment of silence to think about, are you willing to do a Twitter experiment? Think about what that might be. Okay, the conversations I showed clear. Thank you for asking that question. I'm just going to go back to that screen so people know what we're talking about. These are on Google+, and if you're on Google+, we made them all public so anybody can see them, but you can also have conversations that are just restricted to certain people. It's a choice you make on Google+. So if you're interested, Claire, tell me your Google+ name and I'll add you to the conversation, or, give a little flag so you can find it. I think I've got the URL for it in the final URLs, but I can't remember, but I can definitely do that. So now thinking about one experiment you might do. Anybody want to raise their hand and either type or tell us about an experiment you might do? Throwing you into the deep end of the pool right away.
Well, I'm just going to say I'm trying to figure out, again, how this would reach my audience, and it feels like, I don't know, I'm just sort of like time. I really have to be convinced that something's worth not being an early adopter. So
who's your audience?
Well, I have 4 audiences. Jolena represents one of them. She's a tribal person. And then Diane Huckabee is another person. She's a rural librarian. And those, I don't know. If they told me I needed to do it, boy, I'd do it.
Okay, so you just asked the perfect question. So, then you'd ask, Jolene, do you guys use any social media? So, Jolene, do you guys use any social media? Let's play it out. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, Jolena. I'm sorry, I didn't put the A on there.
Jolena, I'm sorry. You can type or grab the mic. Oh, she's typing. Okay. So So the other thing about rural audiences, you know, well, Jolene is typing. Do we have any rural librarians here?
I know that Diane represents Kittitas, which is a rural situation, but I'm putting her kind of on the spot, but she's kind of in I know she's in Ellensburg or lives around Ellensburg, so that's sort of rural, not rural.
So, well, if Diane, you want to type or grab mic, I'll just say one thing that I do work with rural folk, and where this tool becomes useful is when we're using the mobile phone interface, because people aren't necessarily sitting in front of computers, but they are using more and more smartphones. So if I'm really trying to interact with I'm collaborating, let's say, with someone in a rural area who's out a lot because their work is, in this case, agriculture. They're out of, they're not sitting in an office, they're out on a farm. Using social media that have a mobile interface is really useful. So a private conversation, and you can have, by the way, you can have private conversations on Twitter, putting a D before the username, D space Nancy White would send a direct message just to me. So you can use it like an instant messaging system. Now, is there other social media that would be more useful? That's a good question. So let's see. Jolene says, don't use it here at the library, but some of the other tribal programs use Twitter. Okay, so if people are using Twitter, it's definitely worth looking to. If Twitter might fill a hole, it's worth setting up an experiment. So if I'm starting with an audience who doesn't use Twitter but is interested in it, we could do a really interesting experiment together. If they say, absolutely not, we think this is trash, well then you don't want to use Twitter. But I think then you need to think about what's that safe-fail experiment and then how you can measure the success of that experiment or learn from any failures. So let's see, our library might try to set up an account after days. Yeah, it's interesting, Jolena. The question too is, are your constituents using Twitter, or are the other professional peers? So there are different people that you might want to engage with a social media tool. It might be your library clientele. It might be other librarians, or it may be subject matter expertise. So maybe your library is doing a project on gardening and you want to interact with people who are good about bees and pollination. You can use the social media to bring expertise from around the world, literally, into your library. So it's thinking about those audiences in lots of different ways can give us some different things. So Martha's got, okay, good. Yeah, so Martha talks about it took a long time to get approval to experiment with Twitter. This is very typical. And in fact, there's a whole conversation in the nonprofit social media world about how do you talk to your bosses about social media and how do you make a use case, at least for an experimentation, justification for using it. So Diana goes, considering the idea just got a smartphone, it's me. Yeah, with QR codes. So, there's ways to integrate QR codes into Twitter too. So this also brings in, how is this in your workflow? If it fits into your workflow, you're more likely to use it productively than if it's something totally foreign. So for me, if my time is limited, I want to choose tools that fit or are closely related to my current workflow versus things that are way outside of it. So if I had to, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing I've encountered in terms of smartphones and rural clientele is coverage, cell phone coverage. I have a lot of dropped calls when I'm out and about in the rural areas. So that's something else what I would think about in terms of Twitter in the rural areas is how well do I get a smartphone coverage?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And then the other thing is what I find in rural communities, they know which cell phone company gives the best coverage, but those of us coming from outside may have another service that doesn't work well in that community. So am I doing something that's really local or am I doing something that's really not local? And that again plays into some of the technical questions you have about using a tool. So it is pretty complex, isn't it? It's kind of a pain in the butt how complex it is.
One thing I was just going to notice was I'm noticing lots of folk typing and how slow it is for the types to come through. Here we just got a couple and they've been typing for a while, so here they come in our chat box.
So Claire says, like to tap into users of various ebooks or audiobook devices, help each other get over the humps of using specific devices for Overdrive or Net Library resources. Okay. You know, that is a great thing, is to think about what is the communication network for people who are expert on those devices. Are they using a listserv? Are they using Twitter? Are they using a Facebook page? So I would look at the experts, who are the people you need to tap into, and see what they're using. So this is a case of where I need somebody, I want to go where they are. I want to use the tool they're using. So if they're tweeting, now if you find they're on Twitter, Claire, it might be really good to have a hashtag associated with the ebook work at Pierce County Library, so that you could bring together or aggregate those tweets and tell people, if you're interested in tips on how to use ebooks in Pierce County Library, follow this hashtag or go to this Facebook page. So find out where they are, the early adopters are, and then find out a way to bring their expertise into view by using things like hashtags. Okay, so next, Jelena. Yeah, so definitely, and you know, one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to go with the tool that people are talking about the most, and sometimes that's an obvious and perfectly good first choice, but there are sometimes reasons to look at other tools. And again, looking at the demographics, the access issues can give you some ways to help pick and choose. So when you're picking across tools, there's some different sets of criteria you want to bring into play. And then Gina Van Hess goes, Anna Cordes, completely opposed to any form of social media except for LinkedIn. Interesting. Gina, is that in terms of employees using it at work or as a tool to reach the community? Because one of either, okay, this is very interesting, because one of the things we see often from an HR or human resources standpoint is there's a lot of blocking because they're concerned about misuse of time at work or accessing things like pornography, which, you know, is a problem some places, okay? Or frittering around on Facebook. The other side is that our constituencies, just about all of them, are getting some of their information now outside of mainstream media. And that means they're getting a lot of their information from social media. So I think there is a use case to be made about the importance of using social media if there is any outreach, public education, public communication activities happening. In a case where a city is saying absolutely not, there needs to be some conversations. And one of the really effective ways I've seen, there's two effective ways to start these conversations. One is start finding out what the decision makers are using in their personal lives. And I've found senior decision makers saying, you know, their family's using Facebook, or they share photos on Picasa or Flickr. And all of a sudden, when you reframe it that way, they start reevaluating their stance on it. The second is to help them see the stances of people like them in other towns and why there has and what they've found has worked and where they've run into problems, and having those really frank conversations. And there's some good resources for that, should that be something you wanted to do. And as Martha said, she finally received permission. There's also some great examples of good social media policies that very respective organizations have used as they've opened up their social media use, which are also helpful to point to. And again, the personal experimentation. Yep, I do most of my stuff as a personal experimentation because I'm an independent consultant, so that the onus is on me entirely. But when I'm working with clients, I often say, let's do some small experiments. And that helps people get their sea legs, so to speak, and I think that's important. And that also allows you to learn from the things that don't work, because I think organizationally risk is a much bigger issue than it is personally. So if I want to do a book club, I'm going to start with a personal book club, and let's see how it works. Or let me join a book club that somebody else has already started on Twitter and see how that is. Let me go where there's some experience and then bring those stories and make the use case back to my library before I say, let's do an online book club. So for me, I think that's a useful strategy. That's kind of that over-the-shoulder thing you saw in the beginning of the Susie video as well. Other thoughts or questions? Gina's typing again. Claire's typing again. I love seeing the little yellow balloons light up. Because we really talk. Yes, I'm always available for the occasional question. Let's see. Let me put my. Let's see. I'll put in the chat room. I'm at Nancy White on Twitter. And I'm nancy.white@gmail.com on Google Plus. Google, I can spell that plus. I'm Nancy White on Facebook, but there's lots of Nancy Whites on Facebook, and I use Facebook mostly for family, so I would not suggest that's a great place to meet me. And my primary email is this. But what I really love is if you ask the question, I don't know, Jennifer, how do First Tuesday people communicate with each other? Is there a channel there that a question can be asked publicly so that the answer is public?
We do have a listserv, so people can post to the listserv, and it goes out to everyone on the list.
Maybe if someone asked me a question on that list, you could forward it to me.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
And this is Carolyn, and I just had to respond to something Claire typed about ebook readers and setting up things on Overdrive and Google. The State Library is starting a pilot project on this very thing, and one of the things that I would appreciate some input is how you would like to find out. We've got two formal, thank you Nancy White for all the confidence to do this, two formal peer learning where we're going to talk. I'm going to bring all the people on, and we're going to talk about what we've done. There's going to be a group of people who are circulating and a group of people who are just using the ebook readers for staff training. And so I'm kind of trying to figure out how else we should do it, how else we should share the information. So if you're interested in that, please give me a quick contact, because we're getting started really quickly now, and I know this is a topic of interest. Jennifer has found out the same thing, that it's hugely popular to everyone. So if you want to give us some feedback or ask us some questions, we'd sure appreciate it. So thanks. That was my little unendorsed quick jump in there.
Great. Well, and that's how peer learning happens, in those little nooks and crannies of time. Claire, to answer your question, you can do a path search on Twitter conversations either on a hashtag, which is the # and the keyword, or from the username. Google does index tweets, but what I find is they don't keep them for very long, so it's sort of an ephemeral thing. There are tools that allow you to capture things. I used one last week called TweetDoc, because we did an event on Sunday. It was a memorial for a friend's mother. We all baked cookies and gave them away to strangers in honor of his mother, who died last week, because that's what she used to do every Sunday. So the tag was Cookie Love. And if you go to twitter.com and search for Cookie Love, you can see the results of Cookie Love. I then went to TweetDoc and created a PDF that captured all those tweets, so that I've got a history of it. I also tagged those digital artifacts, blog post tweets and stuff using the social bookmarking tool delicious.com, so I could find them again, because for me it was a nice it was a nice use case of the power of online communities and networks, that we can do things that are very warm and human and loving using electronic tools. And that there were different ways that was expressed across those different social media tools. So everybody didn't see everything, but it sure touched a heck of a lot of people, and we ate a lot of cookies on Sunday. So that's an example of the power of this media. Now, the people in Alan's life are online people, so of course it was easy to activate that. But it was really powerful to see how quickly and how far it spread. So the Cookie Love Sunday really became a global thing in a matter of about 48 hours. So it's a powerful medium, especially because it amplifies out. It's not just about the number of people I know, but it's how they pass it along to the people they know. So think of, not one ripple in a pond, but those raindrops create those ever outward flowing ripple patterns. Social media allow us to scale out across a network wider than we can do as an individual, unless you happen to have the world's biggest network. So there's lots of resources on how to do this. But the best thing is find a friend and do it with them. So that would be my closing bit of advice.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We have a couple minutes left for questions. And while I see people typing, Carolyn, did you want to put a plug in for next week or next month?
Well, yes, and I noticed that the gal who's going to be doing it is actually online with us. So please correct me, Martha, if I don't get it quite right. Martha is going to be, she's our youth services consultant here at the State Library, and she's going to be talking about what's new and different for the collaborative program coming out. You should be getting your materials. Usually they come out. I haven't heard that they've showed up yet, but they're going to be coming out to your library fairly soon. And so Martha is going to be talking about what's new and different, but she's also probably going to be asking for some input as to what you'd like to hear. So watch for that. It'll be, like I say, upcoming on our next, it'll be October 4th, and make sure you flag your children's people or anybody who's interested in summer reading.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Nancy. I learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So please don't hesitate to ask Nancy questions, and she gave you contact information, so if things come up afterwards, feel free to contact her afterwards.
I noticed that Martha's typing, so she does have something to say. So, there it goes. Thank you. I have to concur. That was wonderful. And now I'm going to go watch the Vimeo. That wonderful presentation.